In 1943, German prisoners of war in Texas, forged by the rigid doctrine and virulent propaganda of Goebbels, saw America as an intrinsically decadent nation, blind to self-criticism and condemned by its own industrial colossus, an arrogant farce, a contempt born of profound ideological blindness. To them, the nation of T.O. Sam was a fragile chimera, and its films, mere empty distractions, incapable of masking its inevitable ruin. They believed that the exposure of any internal flaw would be conclusive proof of the weakness of a disintegrating society. However, in the improvised cinemas of Campo Hearn, exposure to Hollywood films like As Vinhas da Ira did not reveal the expected weakness, nor the futility of superficial entertainment. On the contrary, it laid bare a shocking and brutally honest self-exposure of social and governmental problems, a visceral dissection of the nation's own wounds. For minds shaped by censorship and the unwavering belief in the ideological superiority of the Tercero Reich, this freedom of expression was an incomprehensible paradox, a direct and frontal challenge to their perception of reality, a blow to the logic of a totalitarian system that forbade doubt and criticism. The brutal honesty with which Americans dissected their own woes, overwhelming rural poverty, endemic political corruption, systemic injustice that permeated society was, in fact, the manifestation of an intrinsic resilience. There was no censorship. There was only an unthinkable systemic self-criticism. This directly challenged the doctrine of infallibility of the Reich, revealing a dimension of resilience that the rigidity of the Blitzkrieg, already forgotten in its dependence on horse and diesel, could never conceive. This ability to identify and correct deficiencies, to expose corruption and misery without fear, signified systemic adaptability. It was a logistics of Conti. While the original ideal of the Blitzkrieg, of speed and logistical superiority, faded into the archaic dependence on horses and diesel that now haunted the Wehrmacht on every battlefront, America refined itself. It grew stronger through the recognition of its imperfections. The distorted perspective, nurtured by Goebbels' virulent propaganda, prevented German officers from recognizing the true hidden strategic dimension in America's logistics of abundance and capacity for self-criticism. Self-criticism, seen as grotesque weakness, was the Achilles heel that would seal the Reich's fate. It revealed the superiority of an industrial colossus that allowed itself to constantly evolve and adapt, contrasting with an enemy that atrophied in the rigidity of its own illusions and its inability to confront the truth. The Nazi Weltanschauung, forged in invincibility and Goebbels' propaganda, was an ideological armor. But every scene of As Vinhas da Ira cracked it. The improvised cinema it was the truth, the resilience that dismantled the narrative of a superior Germany. The unanswered dilemma was incomprehensible. How to be strong while admitting flaws? This capacity for self-examination, for purging wounds, was the antithesis of the Blitzkrieg's rigidity, now forgotten in the archaic dependence on horses and diesel. The limited view gave way, revealing the Reich's Achilles heel. The promise of the Blitzkrieg, the motorized lightning war that crushed Poland and France, was the vanguard of mobility. However, the logistical reality of the Wehrmacht in 1943 was a brutal anachronism. Internal reports, such as those from Generaloberst Franz Halder, detailed a growing dependence on over 2.7 million horses. It was a medieval traction force that contradicted the image of a modern war machine. While Goebbels' propaganda extolled technological superiority, the statistical truth revealed that 80% of German military transport still relied on animals, not efficient trucks or raw. It was a motorized dream that got bogged down in the mud of archaic logistics. The Wehrmacht, a pioneer in the theory of war of movement, was now a prisoner of an infrastructure that the American industrial colossus had already surpassed decades earlier, with its road network and abundance of transport vehicles. The irony was palpable. The enemy that saw itself as the future was stuck in the past, while the nation that openly criticized its flaws was building the true engine of victory. The same limited vision of the Wehrmacht, trapped by archaic methods, also prevented it from understanding the strategic dimension of battlefield communication. The POW, a pillar of German tactical communication, was a technically limited piece of engineering, revealing a terminal flaw that shocked Allied observers due to its ineffectiveness. Tactical paralysis, a contradiction for the Blitzkrieg doctrine forged in speed, was a self-imposed Achilles heel due to a lack of coordination. Goebbels' propaganda. The POW AM had a range of only 3 to 4 kilometers in motion, vulnerable to interference and engine noise. Restricted to command tanks, most panzers operated in an information vacuum, relying on signaling or messengers, tactical relics that stifled fluid maneuvers. Meanwhile, the U.S. equipped its forces with longer range and clearer FM radios, transforming each tank into a node in history's first battlefield network, cohesive. The Nazi doctrine, which forged the Wehrmacht in the belief of innate technological superiority, brutally clashed with the mathematics of production. The very nation that conceived the Blitzkrieg, a war of movement dependent on engines and fuel, failed to provide the basic resources to sustain it. By 1943, while America was producing a GMC CCKW truck every 2 minutes, German industry, fragmented and under bombardment, could barely replace its losses. The ideal of the Blitzkrieg, of a motorized lightning war, was now a distant memory, replaced by a humiliating dependent. It was a systemic failure that Goebbels' propaganda could no longer disguise. The numbers were relentless. German armored vehicle production, though technically sophisticated, was a fraction of the Allied torrent. The incomprehension of the scale of American mass production was a terminal dilemma. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to parsimony and archaic methods, the scale of American production was an affront to military logic. Goebbels dismissed it as industrial madness, but it was the relentless mathematics of victory. In 1944, while Germany struggled to supply its panzers with rationed diesel, Ford, at Willow Run, was producing a B-24 every 63 minutes. This torrent of war material was the tip of the iceberg of an incomprehensible logistics of abundance. German reports after Operation Cobra revealed the officers' shock. Americans discarded damaged vehicles, replacing them with new ones. It was an alien concept for a nation where every sheet of steel was a precious resource. The ideal. America, however, operated in a hidden strategic dimension. The production of 2.5 million GMC CCKW trucks and 600,000 Jeeps was not a luxury, but the foundation of a systemic resilience that crushed the enemy's doctrine. Their distorted ideological vision prevented them from seeing that this madness was the irrefutable capacity of an unprecedented industrial colossus. The Wehrmacht's limited ideological vision paralyzed it on the battlefield. The Reich's doctrine of technological infallibility blinded strategists to the revolution in tactical communication. While German officers clung to the limited FUG-5, a relic, the American Army introduced the SCR-300, a robust FM transceiver. Its simplicity allowed for unprecedented coordination and command, without visual signals or messengers. To the German mind, forged in rigid hierarchy and fragmented communication, the ubiquity and clarity of the SCR-300 were a paradox. Each unit operated as an interconnected node in an invisible mesh of American units operated under an invisible communication mesh. The SCR-300, a portable FM transceiver, 40 to 48 MHz, offered voice clarity and resistance to interference and noise, unattainable by the German AM POW system. The POW, with a range limited to 3 to 4 kilometers while in motion, susceptible to multipath interference and electrical noise, condemned German units to precarious coordination, relying on messengers or visual signaling, tactical relics that stifled rapid maneuvers. The superiority of the SCR-300 went beyond electrical specifications. It resided in its robust design for field use and its deployment scale. German doctrine reserved radios for command vehicles and panzers, creating an information vacuum on the front line and a strategic bottleneck. The American Army, driven by the mathematics of production and the logistics of abundance, produced over 500,000 units of the SCR-300. This allowed every platoon, company, and combat element to be in constant communication, forming A. Fire support orders and flanking maneuvers were transmitted and confirmed instantly, without vulnerable messengers. Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, conceived rapid maneuver warfare and precise coordination. However, the Wehrmacht failed in communication infrastructure. The reliance on horses for over 80% of transport and the failure in vehicle and fuel production were part of the logistical equation. Also, it was the inability to create a ubiquitous and resilient communication network, a gap that Goebbels' virulent propaganda did not fill. The SCR-300, in contrast, transformed the American soldier from an isolated individual into a node in history's first battlefield network. It neutralized enemy bravery with the collective superiority of an interconnected and adaptable command. This real-time interconnection and coordination was true systemic resilience. The irony was profound. Germany, which boasted superiority and pioneering in maneuver tactics, was stuck with attacked. It was an irrefutable capability that the limited ideological vision of the Reich would never comprehend or effectively combat. It was the mathematics of production applied to communication, transforming each unit into a sensor and actuator of an adaptable combat organism. A systemic resilience that Goebbels could not discredit. Self-criticism, encoded in every clear and instant transmission, was the true superiority. While the Wehrmacht struggled with tactical coordination, the true dimension of its strategic vulnerability lay in the geometry of abundance, a concept alien to its war doctrine. The ideal of the Blitzkrieg, of incessant and self-sufficient maneuver warfare, had been tragically forgotten, replaced by an archaic dependency. In 1943, over 80% of the Wehrmacht's transportation was still carried out by millions of horses, a brutally honest statistic that unmasked the image of a mechanized force. Synthetic fuel production, though technically advanced, never reached a scale N. Diaries of German officers, such as General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, frequently lamented the chronic scarcity of motor vehicles and the impossibility of maintaining operational pace without animal traction. It was an incomprehensible logistical failure for a nation that saw itself as the pinnacle of engineering. But what the German command failed to realize was that while they were counting horses, the American industrial colossus was already orchestrating a deluge of steel and rubber. America, which Goebbels described as decadent and weak, was building a war machine of unprecedented scale. By 1943, American factories produced over 600,000 GMC CCKW trucks, the famous deuce and a half. This number alone exceeded Germany's total military vehicle production throughout the entire conflict. Each of these vehicles was a vital node in the logistical network feeding the front, capable of transporting 2.5 tons of cargo over hundreds of kilometers. The math of production was relentless. While a Panzer VI Tiger, an engineering marvel, required 100 man-hours of maintenance for every 6 hours of operation and consumed 1,000 liters of fuel for every 100 kilometers, the GMC CCKW operated with an efficiency and redundancy that defied German military logic. The superiority was not merely numerical, it was systemic. German doctrine, focused on elite combat platforms and resource scarcity, could not conceive of a system where abundance was the norm. The production of Willys MB Jeeps, with over 640,000 units, transformed tactical mobility. This allowed every American platoon to have rapid reconnaissance and transport capability, something unthinkable for the enemy. The ability to move ton-miles of supplies, from ammunition to rations, from spare parts to fuel, was the true strategic weapon. The Red Ball Express, a truck-based logistical network operating 24/7, moved over 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. It was a feat the Wehrmacht, with its horses and bombed railway, for General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keidel, the site of uninterrupted American convoys, transporting supplies on a seemingly limitless scale, was an unsolvable enigma. His own intelligence reports, often underestimated or ignored by the Reich's leadership, indicated that America's replenishment capacity was so vast that the destruction of a unit or a convoy was quickly compensated for by a continuous flow of replacements. The distorted ideological vision prevented them from seeing that this weakness of not having super armas in every vehicle was in fact the intrinsic resilience of a system that valued resilience and redundancy above the individual excellence of a platform. America was not just building vehicles, it was building a war infrastructure that redefined the very nature of logistics, transforming it from a bottleneck into a force multiplier. The mathematics of abundance was not just about having more, it was about having enough to never stop, to absorb losses, and to maintain. The initial offensive by the Afrika Korps, under the command of General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, erupted with expected ferocity. It pushed American forces into a tactical retreat that, at first glance, seemed to confirm German doctrine of tactical superiority and the adversary's weakness. However, the apparent initial victory concealed a brutally honest truth. It was a hidden strategic dimension that would manifest as a deafening silence for the Wehrmacht. The inability to comprehend the American radio web. As the panzers advanced, German coordination, dependent on messengers and the limited range of the FUG-5, began to disintegrate. The ideal of the Blitzkrieg, of incessant, self-sufficient war of movement, had been tragically forgotten, replaced by an archaic dependence on animal traction and chronically deficient fuel logistics that condemned its units to immobility. For Major Hans von Luck, commander of the 15th Panzer Regiment, the confusion began when the seemingly disorganized. There were no visual signs of centralized command, nor the movement of messengers indicating a restructuring. It was as if the American units were connected by an invisible thread, a tactical nervous system that allowed for systemic self-criticism and real-time course correction. The SCR-300, with its frequency modulation, FM, and crystal-clear clarity, transformed each platoon into a node in history's first battlefield network. Of an unprecedented command and control network. While the German Fug-5 radios struggled with multipath interference and electrical noise, limiting communication to a mere 3 to 4 kilometers, the American web operated on a scale and with a resilience that rendered German coordination a tactical relic. The irony was profound. The Wehrmacht, which boasted of its Blitzkrieg, was being systematically nullified by an adversary operating with a coordination that German doctrine itself aimed for, but never achieved at scale. German intelligence reports, later analyzed, they could not intercept or understand the complex FM communication network, which operated on multiple channels and with a security that the German AM system lacked. Their limited ideological vision prevented them from seeing that this weakness of not having superweapons in every vehicle was in fact the intrinsic resilience of a system that valued resilience and redundancy above the individual excellence of a platform. The mathematics of American production, which had flooded the battlefield with over 50,000 SCR-300 units, ensured that the radio web was ubiquitous. Every Sherman, every Willys Jeep, every infantry platoon was an active communication point, transforming the battlefield into an adaptable organism. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht struggled with fuel shortages, the maintenance of its heavy panzers, and the reliance on millions of horses for logistical transport. It was an incomprehensible logistical failure for a nation that saw itself as the pinnacle of engineering. The Wehrmacht's despair did not stem from a lack of bravery, but from the systematic nullification of its tactical advantages by a hidden strategic dimension, the superiority of communication and the logistics of abundance. America was not just building vehicles, it was building a war infrastructure that would redefine the very nature of logistics, transforming it from a bottleneck into a force multiplier. July 1944, Normandy, France. After weeks of incessant attrition in the hedgerows, the German command, exhausted but still indoctrinated by the belief in the tactical superiority and resilience of the Wehrmacht, prepared for what it considered another brutal defensive battle. Operation Cobra, the Allied offensive to break out of the St. Lo pocket, was anticipated as a conventional assault. However, what unfolded was not a battle, but a tsunami of consumption. It was an annihilation by logistical overload that defied all German military comprehension and exposed the already compromised. The artillery barrage and air support were not merely intense, they were sustained by a volume of supplies that seemed to defy physics. In a single day, the U.S. Air Force dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs, creating craters not only in the earth, but also in German morale and command structure. But the true shock was not the initial destruction, but the American capacity to capitalize on it with a speed and scale that the Wehrmacht could not match. While the German panzer divisions crawled, limited by a chronic fuel shortage and the reliance on millions of horses, a brutally honest statistic that debunked the image of a mechanized force, the American columns advanced. The Red Ball Express, a 24/7 trucking logistics network, moved over 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. This included not only ammunition and fuel, but also spare parts that allowed damaged Sherman tanks to be repaired and returned to combat in a matter of hours, not days or weeks, as was the norm for the Pans. The mathematics of production was relentless. For every Tiger I lost, Germany had no immediate replacement. For every damaged Sherman, there was a continuous flow of parts and new vehicles. Major Hans von Luck, observing the American offensive, recorded his bewilderment in his diary. They wouldn't stop. Even when our counterattacks caused significant losses, new units and supplies appeared as if sprouting from the ground. The limited German ideological view prevented them from understanding that American resilience did not lie in the invulnerability of their platforms, but in the redundancy and replacement capacity of their industrial colossus. The SCR-300, the invisible radio web, allowed American units to coordinate their advances and logistical support with rigorous precision and speed that the Wehrmacht, with its limited FUG-5 radios and messengers, did not possess. The systemic self-criticism allowed the Americans to adapt their supply routes and support points in real time. The strategic annihilation did not come from a single decisive blow, but from continuous overload. General Feldmarschall Rommel, before being wounded, had expressed his frustration with the enemy's overwhelming material superiority, a phrase that, to the German mind, seemed like an excuse for a lack of bravery. But the truth was grimmer. Bravery without resources is merely delayed defeat. The Wehrmacht, despite fighting with ferocity, was systematically nullified by the American system. The armored vehicle kill ratio, which at Kasserine had initially been favorable to the Germans, drastically reversed, with Allied forces losing one vehicle for every 7 to 10 German vehicles destroyed or abandoned due to lack of fuel or parts. In a moment of rare candor, General Feldmarschall Keitel, in a meeting with Hitler, reportedly admitted that the American capacity to flood the battlefield with men and materiel is a weapon against which we have no defense. This was not a failure of strategy. Germany, which had pioneered maneuver warfare, had forgotten that speed and penetration intrinsically depended on incessant logistics. The reliance on horses and the failure to produce fuels and vehicles were the Achilles heels that a limited ideological vision did not allow them to recognize. The American tsunami of consumption was not just a matter of numbers. It was the material proof of a hidden strategic dimension, an intrinsic resilience that transformed the battlefield into a meat grinder for the Wehrmacht, where logistics beat the platform and the factory beat the battlefield. In 1944, in the prisoner of war camps in Texas, Goebbels' propaganda had forged German minds to see America as a decadent and blind nation. However, the sight of Coca-Cola barrels being discarded in ditches, not because they were spoiled, but because they were surplus, from a production that exceeded demand, revealed not the expected weakness, but the shocking mathematics of abundance. For Mine says, it was a direct challenge to their perception of reality and the ideal of the Blitzkrieg, which was fading into dependence on horses and diesel. For Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Richter, a Waffen-SS officer captured in Normandy, the scene was an affront. In his diary, he would describe the bitter taste, not of the drink, but of the incomprehension it generated. The Wehrmacht, which fought desperately for every liter of fuel and kilogram of rations, with men and horses hungry and exhausted, could not conceive of a system where discarding such a valuable product was an option. Germany, a pioneer in maneuver warfare, had forgotten that speed and penetration intrinsically depended on incessant logistics. And now it faced the consequences of that limited ideological vision. The psychology of German indigence was an insurmountable chasm. Propaganda had conditioned soldiers to believe that scarcity was a sign of noble sacrifice, of an existential struggle against a materialistic enemy. But the sight of Coca-Cola being thrown away, millions of gallons of the concentrated syrup, was not a sign of weakness. It was the visceral manifestation of the intrinsic resilience of an industrial colossus, operating on a scale that defied their reality. For the Americans, the disposal was inventory management and logistics, proof of surplus production capacity. For the prisoners, it was a sacrilege, the mathematics of abundance, which they had no means to combat. As Richter and his companions observed this tsunami of consumption, the reality of their own situation became even clearer. In 1943, over 80% of the Wehrmacht's transport was still carried out by millions of horses. A brutal statistic that unmasked the image of a mechanized force and the ideal of the Blitzkrieg. Synthetic fuel production, though advanced, never reached the scale necessary to supply the demand of a war on multiple fronts. Condemning entire divisions to immobility, the logistical failure was incomprehensible. America, which Goebbels described as decadent and weak, was building a war machine of unprecedented scale, where even luxury was produced in volumes that allowed for disposal. Coca-Cola, with its omnipresence in American rations and PXs, was more than a drink. It was a tangible symbol of logistical superiority and production capacity that the Wehrmacht could never match. General Feldmarschall Keitel, in his reports, would have noted the American replenishment capability as a weapon against which we have no defense. However, the depth of this abundance, which extended to the disposal of consumer goods, remained a hidden strategic dimension, an Achilles heel for the German mentality. The irony was profound. Germany, which prided itself on its doctrine of efficiency and the Blitzkrieg, a war of incessant, self-sufficient movement, was trapped in a reality of scarcity and archaic dependence. America, seen as a conglomerate of loose individuals, demonstrated systemic resilience. This self-criticism of production itself, where excess was discarded, was material proof of an undeniable capacity that the Reich's limited ideological view would never comprehend or effectively combat. The mathematics of production was not just about having more. It was about having enough to never stop, to absorb losses, and to maintain constant pressure, a superiority that extended from ammunition to soda. The bitter taste of discarded Coca-Cola was the first sign that the war was irremediably lost, not for lack of bravery, but for the incomprehension of a hidden strategic dimension. This revelation, felt in captivity, already echoed in the confidential diaries and reports of the Wehrmacht, an industrial epitaph in numbers and tactical despair. In 1943, General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein lamented the enemy's overwhelming material superiority. It was a brutal realization of logistical reality. He described America's ability to replenish losses and sustain offensives with The ideological view, fostered by propaganda, prevented the Reich's leadership from understanding the source of this intrinsic resilience. They saw American abundance as luxury and decadence, not as systemic resilience. General Heinz Guderian, a visionary of mobile warfare, frustratedly recorded the paralysis of his panzer divisions, not for lack of tanks or bravery, but due to the chronic absence of fuel and parts. His 1944 diaries lament the archaic dependence on the horse, over 80% of Wehrmacht transport, and the failure to sustain the logistics of mechanized warfare. American production, which flooded the battlefield, while Germany barely produced a tenth, was an incomprehensible paradox for the German mentality accustomed to scarcity. For General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, the situation was grimmer. His reports, ignored by Hitler, quantified the industrial disparity with rigorous precision. The American capacity to produce ton-miles of supplies, from ammunition, the armored-kill ratio, favorable to the Germans in Kasserine, reversed itself in Normandy, not due to the Panzer's failure, but to the American capacity to replenish losses in hours. The SCR-300's radio web, allowing systemic self-criticism and real-time coordination, transformed each American unit into a node in history's first battlefield network, neutralizing individual bravery with the collective superiority of an interconnected and adaptable command. The irony was brutal. Germany, a pioneer in war of movement, was trapped in a tactical and logistical relic, while America, seen as an industrial colossus, demonstrated a strategic dimension where abundance was the weapon itself. The diaries of these generals were not just records of battles, but the gradual surrender to an undeniable truth. The factory won the battlefield, and the logistics of abundance was the true strategy. The incomprehension of this fundamental equation This limited ideological vision that underestimate. The ideological vision, which fostered invincibility, yielded to the brutal mathematics of defeat. War diaries attested to the epitaph of the Wehrmacht. Keitel, in 1944, admitted to Hitler that American overwhelming material superiority was indefensible. Guderian lamented the archaic dependence on the horse, a paradox for the architect of the Blitzkrieg. The incomprehension of the production and logistics of abundance, a hidden dimension, revealed a systemic flaw. For the Wehrmacht, indoctrinated by propaganda, war was a clash of ingenuity where quality would overcome volume. But the battlefield revealed a quantitative tsunami, a flood of steel and modulated frequency with indomitable power. For minds shaped by scarcity, this abundance was an unsolvable dilemma, a challenge to their military perception. For the German prisoners in Texas, forged by doctrine and propaganda, America was a decadent nation blind to self-criticism. However, in the makeshift cinemas of Camp Hearn, films, for minds shaped by censorship, this honest freedom of expression was an unanswerable dilemma, a direct challenge to their ideology. This self-criticism, perceived as weakness, was the relentless mathematics of systemic resilience, a superiority that the Wehrmacht, limited by its ideology, would never comprehend. For the Wehrmacht, forged in the Blitzkrieg, logistics was a mere operational appendage. They saw combat as a symphony of tanks and tactics, forgetting that the Blitzkrieg depended on supplies. For the Allies, the mathematics of abundance transformed the battlefield into an industrial ecosystem. Every GMC truck, every gallon of fuel were vectors of incessant strategy, a hidden strategic dimension that the limited German ideological vision, trapped by horses and scarce diesel, would never decipher. The Wehrmacht's doctrine, forged in tactical superiority and propaganda, disdained logistical complexity, seeing it as a burden, not a decisive weapon. They never conceived that for minds stuck with scarce diesel and horses, the ubiquity of American modulated frequency was an insoluble dilemma, a brutal challenge to the Blitzkrieg, revealing the relentless mathematics of logistical and technological superiority that the limited German ideological vision would never decipher.